Human history is packed with unbelievable events, fascinating folklore, and amazing true stories that help us really understand why our world is so weird. There are countless events throughout history that have changed the trajectory of the timeline we all share. But the truth in history is often hidden in secret. Many civilizations throughout history have valued cats as a way to control pest populations and the problems they cause. But the true history of the ancient Egyptians has some stories that would be considered especially weird in modern times. The Egyptians believed that cats were the physical embodiment of Bastet, a goddess of protection who, as a cat herself, would have been displeased to learn of a war against her creations many years later during the 13th century. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX made a stunning announcement to the world. The history between cats and witchcraft is well known, and now was the time in Europe to do away with such creatures. All felines were said to be nocturnal servants of evil without exception, and with the Pope's decree, cats were an enemy of the religious state. With this strange announcement, towns and villages across Europe began culling their cat populations, and even dogs to a lesser extent, believing that all such animals were harbingers of evil. Little did they know the darkest moments in human history were yet to come. As cats were cast out, the Black Plague was let in. What society did not know was that cats did an excellent job at suppressing the rodent population, who were the true carriers of the Black Plague. With no cats, rats soon spread the dreadful condition across human populations in large cities. People had been eliminating cats and dogs because fleas were believed to have caused the infection to spread. By the time they began to recognize the science behind their mistakes, it was already too late. About 25 million human lives were lost in total to the Black Plague. Although the condition would have likely spread to millions had cats not been eliminated from towns and cities, many historians now agree that the impact may not have been so severe if the unbelievable war on cats had never happened. Fortunately, with the rise of modern civilization, feline appreciation is surging throughout the world at an all-time high. So the unbelievable events leading up to this dark era of history are unlikely to repeat in the exact same way. Long before Ronald Reagan was an actor or the President of the United States, he was already a hero in his hometown of Dixon, Illinois. The story of Ronald Reagan's rise to fame is perhaps one of the most unbelievable moments in history. Between 1927 and 1934, Reagan worked as a lifeguard at the Rock River, hoping to save up enough money to make his acting dreams come true. Reagan was reported to have worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, to ensure that swimmers in Rock River were always safe. Throughout his 7-year tenure, Reagan had an amazing career history. He saved the lives of 77 people. Every time he saved someone from drowning, he tallied a notch on a log that he kept at the edge of Rock River. Years later, a plaque was erected in honor of his many career accomplishments, all starting with the dozens of lives he had saved as a lifeguard. Nobody from his hometown of Dixon, Illinois could have ever imagined that his hometown would become the home of a famous actor, no less a sitting US president. And in a weird twist of fate, Ronald's incredible history as a lifeguard didn't stop at the Rock River. In 1969, many years after leaving his hometown and becoming famous, Reagan was at a pool party at the governor's house. He watched a 7-year-old girl who couldn't swim lose her flotation device and go under. He politely excused himself from conversation and jumped in fully clothed. Amazingly, Ronald was able to retrieve her from the bottom of a pool, bringing the tally to 78 lives saved. Ronald Reagan remains one of the most well-known and most controversial US presidents in history. His time in office was filled with public pushback, though his talents as a lifeguard remain an indisputably heroic, albeit weird side note in his historic legacy. 22-year-old Vesna Vulovic had recently landed the job of her dreams as a flight attendant. Born in Yugoslavia, Vesna discovered her love of flying and traveling after moving to the UK to learn English. She aced her flight attendant training and got a job with JAT Airways in her home country. Less than a year later, her promising career as a flight attendant would be changed forever by the darkest moments of her life. A bizarre event would place Vesna into the history books forever, and not in a way that most would want to be remembered. On January 26, 1972, Vesna was prepping the plane for a flight from Sweden to Serbia. They had one stopover in Copenhagen and anticipated a 4-hour flight. At 3:15 p.m., the flight took off from Stockholm, bound for Belgrade. But just 46 minutes into the flight, history would be made. An explosion ripped the plane in half over Srpska Kamenica. Locals gathered around after hearing the plane split in two. Of everyone on board, Vesna Vulovic was the only person found alive. She was in rough condition and remained in a coma for a few days before coming to, after which it took her just 10 months to recover, an unbelievable recovery time considering the extent of what had happened. The Guinness Book of World Records visited Vesna, and she still holds the record for the highest fall survival story in history: 33,330 feet, more than 6 miles. The staggering fall had left Vesna with permanent memory loss, and she mercifully had no recollection of what had happened. If you asked her, she would tell you that her childhood history of eating plenty of spinach and drinking fish oil was the reason why she pulled through. In reality, she was at a food cart in the back of the plane, a cart that was later found pinning her down, and therefore she was the farthest away from the explosion that took them down. Theories suggest tumbling down tall pine trees could have greatly reduced the impact of her fall. Finally, her history of low blood pressure could have also kept her from succumbing to certain heart complications that others would have experienced. With that said, her survival story is still one of the most unbelievable moments in history. To this day, Vesna is considered an incredible medical marvel, and her survival leaves doctors baffled. Strangest of all, Vesna was never afraid to go flying after this event, and she continued to enjoy a lengthy travel history right up until her passing in 2016. Astronomer Edmund Halley first predicted Halley's Comet in 1705, only to have it come true in 1758. The comet was welcomed as a world marvel, but a later appearance in 1910 would grow to become one of history's greatest cases of mass panic. 3 years before Halley's Comet was predicted to pass the Earth once more, scientists and astronomers began drumming up fear and uncertainty. Newspaper stories began publishing conflicting reports about the severity of the upcoming historic event. One French scientist kicked off the mass hysteria by proclaiming an untold horror story was waiting to unfold, the darkest moments of all time. Not only would Earth come into contact with Halley's Comet, but the comet's tail would release cyanogen gas into the atmosphere upon impact, potentially spelling the end of human history as we know it. People desperately began looking for ways to protect themselves and their families against what they feared to be the greatest historical event of all time. Fake remedies such as nonsensical supplements and protective clothing were peddled as solutions to protect against the effects of the gas. The world started a slow countdown as 1910 rang in. On April 20th, 1910, the first signs of Halley's Comet were spotted. Human history was racing to an unexpected ending, it seemed, and it was no longer hidden or kept secret. Families huddled together expecting the end, but within a few weeks, people realized the mass panic was for nothing. Halley's Comet passed without incident. As a side note, the weird history between Halley's Comet and historical figure Mark Twain is perhaps one of the strangest coincidences ever documented. When Mark Twain was born in 1835, the legendary comet was spotted, and when it was seen again in 1910, it was the year that Mark Twain left this world. On August 23, 1914, something bizarre happened a month into World War II, when 4,000 British soldiers found themselves outnumbered more than 5 to 1 by German forces in Mons, Belgium. During their darkest moments, angels clutching bows and arrows descended from the sky to save them from certain doom. Their prayers answered, the British troops escaped, while celestial giants held off the encircling Germans. This bizarre story quickly spread through the battalions and the camps of the British forces, and was used as motivation for everyone to fight harder. That same year, a popular short story was published in a London article telling of the events. The general public thought the untold story was a strange but true event, and urban legends about the encounter continue to circulate today. But could the weird history behind the events on that day be a mere urban legend? In 1915, one survivor spoke of a cloud-like formation that swept in between the British and German formations, suggesting a strange weather event could explain their historic retreat. However, another soldier insists that everyone was hallucinating from days of marching and from the stress of being captured or worse. Some say they were sharing a mass delusion, while others insist that divine intervention was involved. Either way, the story of the Angels of Mons is easily one of history's greatest mysteries to have ever come out of that unbelievable time period. As the events of World War I sent countless brave young men into the darkest moments of history, droves of young women suddenly had to support themselves and those left behind. Factory work became commonplace, and in 1917, the U.S. Radium Corporation opened a factory in Orange, New Jersey that would leave behind a strange but true legacy. The pay was about 3 times higher than any other New Jersey job, and thousands of women flocked to work here. But with higher profits came an untold horror that they would not realize until it was far too late. This is the dark and disturbing true story of the Radium Girls as they would become known in history. The women were tasked with painting watch faces. They sat at watch painting stations for hours a day. Factory managers even told the women to lick their brushes to make the bristles form finer points. The material they were working with was a special undark paint, a strange new formula that glowed in the dark. Some of the ladies would decorate their clothing, nails, and even their teeth with the delightful glow, a glow that would come at a high cost and wouldn't be revealed until much later. The paint glowed in the dark because it contained a highly dangerous isotope known as radium-226. But radium itself has a very weird history. The toxic substance was, at the time, touted as a remedy for everything from digestion problems to, ironically, preventing tumors. Amelia Molly Magia was the first to meet an unexpected ending. She developed a long and mysterious history of medical problems as her teeth fell out and her jaw weakened until it eventually needed removal. She, like many others at the factory, mysteriously had problems with fatigue and joint problems. 1922 was when her darkest moments finally came to pass, and she was no more. The doctors, who historians think may have been bribed, absolutely refused to blame the factory. Molly's friend and factory co-worker, Grace Fryer, experienced similar medical issues, right down to the jaw problems, and she sued the factory for compensation. The men were not given lead aprons and The men in the factory were given lead aprons and other safety equipment as protection. The women were not. Grace filed a case after spending years trying to find a lawyer brave enough to take on the large corporation. Under court orders, Magia's remains were tested, and the radioactive isotope was found present in her body, proving the world wrong about radium and forever changing the course of medical history throughout the world. Unfortunately, Grace would pass away in 1933 before the case would reach a verdict in 1938 in their favor. The true history of the undark paint came to surface, and the factory owners were held fully responsible. Of the 70 factory workers who history has famously dubbed the Radium Girls, only 20 would survive long enough to receive financial compensation. On September 1st, 1944, Alice Kearney of Mattoon, Illinois, was sound asleep in her bed after a long day at work. Most of the men had gone off to make history in World War II, leaving behind the women and those unable to serve. Alice felt safe in her small town, thinking that the bizarre crime stories she'd heard about only happened in big cities. But September 1st, 1944 would prove her wrong. That night, Alice awoke to what she called a sickening sweet odor in her bedroom. As the smell worsened, she tried to get up to find its source, but found she was paralyzed from the waist down. Unable to rise from bed, she screamed for her sister to come help. That's when she noticed a strange, shadowy figure standing by the window who would soon vanish into thin air. Little did the Kearneys know that this was just the weird beginning of one of history's biggest mysteries. After Alice Kearney's encounter, countless others had untold stories to share, each insisting that the events were strange but true. On September 5th, 4 days after the attack on Alice Kearney, Carl and Bula Cords spoke of similar attacks. Bula later told the police that she found a rag on her front door, and after getting a whiff of a strange smell, she described a similar story to Alice Kearney of being unable to move. Her husband Carl immediately sought out the suspect to no avail. With numerous criminal reports, the press took to calling the mysterious man the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. The townsfolk grouped together at night to stay safe, but soon they began to eye each other with suspicion. Scary stories of the Mad Gasser described him as a man with dark clothing wearing a hat. He could almost be any one of them. As with many small-town crime stories, multiple agencies were brought in to assist, but no true identity of the Mad Gasser was ever found. Some investigators doubted if the story was true or just an urban legend hoax created by Alice Kearney and perpetuated by other townsfolk. Those who had supposedly encountered the Mad Gasser insisted that their stories are strange but true. In years gone by, the bizarre urban legend of the Mad Gasser of Mattoon has permeated pop culture and remains one of the weirdest stories in history. In 1917, Austrian neurologist Konstantin von Economo published a series of papers that identified a previously unknown condition he called sleeping sickness. Konstantin had witnessed hundreds of people becoming ill and falling asleep for abnormally long periods of time. Fearing that World War I had brought about new ailments, doctors and physicians scrambled to treat patients. Over 100 years later, we now know a great deal more about the sleeping sickness that changed the course of world history. But that doesn't make the true story behind it any less strange and bizarre. Hundreds upon thousands of people found themselves hospitalized between 1917 and 1927 with the so-called sleeping sickness. Patients were noted to be asleep for days, even weeks at a time, and doctors were only able to rouse them from their sleep for a few minutes. High temperatures, headaches, chills, paralysis, and physical weaknesses were noted. Some had untold stories of vivid hallucinations during their prolonged period of fitful slumber. It was a truly weird chapter of history. Hospitals were filling with hundreds of catatonic patients who wanted to wake from a living nightmare. The exact number of those diagnosed with sleeping sickness is unknown. Many people made a full recovery. However, some people were left with long-term effects, such as mental and physical health issues. By 1928, the mysterious bug had vanished. Today, there is treatment available to those affected and a much better prognosis. Vampires have been an integral part of folklore and other scary stories for many centuries, including some real-life horror stories as well. In 1892, the town of Exeter, Rhode Island, became convinced that an actual vampire had been living among them. What followed remains a strange but true untold story that history has all but forgotten. In the 1880s, George Brown lived in Exeter with his wife and children. The Browns were honest, hard-working farmers, but just like everyone else during that time, their family had been stricken with tuberculosis, which had historically decimated the population during that time. George had lost his wife, Mary Eliza, along with his children, Mary Olive and Mercy, by 1892. With so many sudden losses, the superstitious townsfolk began to suspect a deeply hidden paranormal mystery was unfolding within the Browns family history. These rumors became scary stories about one of the Browns possibly being a vampire. In a bid to explain this weird historical mystery once and for all, George, along with Exeter residents, exhumed the bodies of his family members in March of 1892. Mary Eliza and Mary Olive were not vampires because their bodies showed no signs of being disturbed. Still unhappy, the townsfolk continued grave digging until they discovered the body of Mercy Brown. What they found in the casket made them recoil in horror. Mercy's body looked the same as it had when she was buried 9 weeks earlier. The people of Exeter finally had their proof that a vampire had been living among them. Bizarre and outlandish rituals and practices took hold, and the town now firmly believed that Mercy Brown had been a vampire. Parts of her body were used to create superstitious tuberculosis remedies for her brother Edwin. Unfortunately, this magical cocktail did little to help Edwin's condition, and he passed away soon after. Doctors in Exeter tried to explain to the townsfolk that Mercy's body had been in perfect condition due to the frigid cold, but the townsfolk were convinced by their own eyes. In modern-day Exeter, the story of Mercy Brown is still an incredibly popular urban legend to this day. Although to the rest of the world, this weird history story remains largely untold. The story of Mary Toft is perhaps one of the most bizarre tales in all of British history. It's a true lesson not to blindly believe any situation that seems too strange to be true. You see, in 1726, Mary Toft of London declared that she'd given birth to rabbits. People flocked from far and wide to witness a poor, illiterate woman giving birth to several tiny rabbits at a time. Shocking tales of Mary's unbelievable condition quickly made history throughout the land. Soon, hundreds of doctors demanded an audience with Mary to study whatever weird science was involved. It wasn't just doctors that became fascinated with the details behind Mary's untold story, though. King George I himself sent one of his personal doctors, Nathaniel St. Andre, to find out more. St. Andre became obsessed with solving the strange case of Mary Toft, and ensured that he was there for one of her historic live events. He took a few of the rabbits back to the palace to show King George I, and convinced everyone, even the king, that she was somehow the first woman in world history pregnant with rabbits. As the months went on, skepticism began to grow, and Mary's true history was revealed. After doing more research on the rabbits, the more astute doctors questioned how they were able to detect traces of food in the stomachs of newborn rabbits. An animal born with a half-digested meal in its stomach seemed like a highly unlikely event. Even someone who was largely willing to believe the stories up to this point would have had a problem with that. Eventually, history would condemn Mary when either she, or according to other accounts, one of her associates, was caught sneaking rabbits into her room. Despite this, she still stuck to her weird truth. She would later tell newspapers that her births had been the work of a bizarre paranormal force, and that she had been forced to confess that it had all been fraudulent to conceal the truth. Mary lived the rest of her life in obscurity, and her strange tale remains a weird point in history when baffled scientists were momentarily convinced that rabbits could somehow come from another. Our current understanding of human history suggests that the ancient Sumerians were the first to use a writing system. The cuneiform script was created around 3500 BC and used around the Near East. But according to some scholars, there was a writing system used in Europe that predates even this ancient writing. The Vinča culture was an important civilization that existed between 5700 and 4500 BC. It was a complex society that existed throughout the Balkans, with the majority of the culture lying in modern-day Serbia and Kosovo. In some ways, it was a descendant of the Lipinski-Ver culture that had existed thousands of years earlier, but had many other influences as it was spread over such a wide area. The culture is named after the Belgrade suburb of Vinča, where the first artifacts from this civilization were discovered in 1908. The Vinca occupied the site for roughly 300 years, and left behind a wealth of archaeological evidence, including figurines and the foundations of their homes. Many of the figurines created in the later years of the occupation were inscribed with strange markings that had never been seen before. This was the second time modern scholars had been presented with what's now called the Vinca script, or Vinca symbols. The symbols were first discovered in 1875 at the Romanian site of Tordos. Archaeologists there found pottery marked with symbols. Over the next 140 years, roughly 1,000 artifacts with the Vinca symbols have been located, but figuring out what the markings are has left researchers baffled. Some believe the symbols are ancient letters from a long-forgotten writing system. The little pictograms do somewhat resemble the markings that would eventually become cuneiform in Sumeria. But the significance of the similarities is debated, and it's not commonly believed that cuneiform evolved from the pictograms. The problem with the idea that this is a writing system is just how short most of the inscriptions are. 85% of the inscriptions consist of only a single symbol, and many of the symbols are not repeated. 1/6 of the symbols used are described as comb or brush patterns, and may represent numbers. Most of the symbols are found on pots, which were used in trade around the Vinca culture. Others were found on small tablets or inscribed on figurines, like those located in the Vinca suburb. One story is that the symbols might have been used to represent a god or gods, which would indicate a cuneiform culture throughout the Vinca lands, and one that didn't change much over time. This would be strange. Even the famous Greco-Roman gods changed considerably from place to place and over time periods. The symbols might also have been simple images of what was stored in a pot or desired during a ritual offering of the figurines. This would make the symbols a sort of proto-writing. It never developed into a full writing system though, as the Vinca civilization declined in around 4500 BC, and the use of the symbols faded around 1,000 years later. The Vinca symbols are very controversial in archaeology, with debates about exact dates as well as what the script was used for still ongoing. It's possible this mystery is one destined to never be solved. For years, the locals living in the Fujian Lake in China told legends of an underwater city that could be seen from the nearby mountains on clear days. It wasn't until 1992 that divers went beneath the water to confirm that something strange and mysterious did exist down there. It's the third deepest freshwater lake in the country, reaching a depth of 155 meters, and is home to many endemic species of fish. For centuries, the lake had an almost mystical quality to it. It's said that 2 emissaries from the Jade Emperor were so entranced by its beauty that they were turned into statues on the side of the lake. It's also said to be home of a winged horse, and there have been many UFO sightings from the area. The story of the lost city beneath the water was just another one of the folklore tales until 1992 when the truth was revealed. An experienced diver named Gang Wei went down into the water to try to find proof. He discovered a sunken city lying not far beneath the water. It was made out of stone with intricate carvings and artifacts scattered among them. Later research determined that the city was between 2.5 and 2.7 square kilometers in area, which would have made it larger than the capital of the Han Dynasty. It was made up of around 30 buildings which were connected by cobblestone streets, as well as several pyramid-like structures. This was obviously an impressive and important find. Even beyond the size of the underwater city, the fact it was made of stone set it apart from what researchers were expecting to find. For such an advanced city to disappear beneath the water without any apparent mention in the historical record was very strange. There are reports of one city that disappeared in Chinese history. The Yuyuan city had once sat at the northern shore of Fujian Lake, before apparently vanishing without a trace. For a while, researchers believed they might have found the lost city of Yuyuan, but the fact that the buildings were made of stone meant that was unlikely. Yuyuan buildings had been made from clay and wood. Carbon dating of the artifacts found in the city determined that it sank around 1750 years ago. This was long before the last mention of Yuyuan existed on land, suggesting that this isn't the lost city. Another hypothesis was that this was the capital of the ancient Dian Kingdom. However, the Dian Kingdom fell long before the artifacts found at the lost city were created, ruling out that as a possibility as well. For now, the identity of this mysterious city remains unknown. but experts are confident that with enough research and time, the truth may be revealed. In 2017, metal detectorists in Switzerland made a strange discovery that experts still haven't been able to understand. The two treasure hunters found something completely unique while searching near Lake Beale. They pulled a lump of cracked and worn metal from the ground. Also found at the site were a bladed object and a rib bone. After cleaning up the lump of metal, they realized just how intricate it was. It was a bronze hand, colored green after being exposed to the elements for thousands of years. Around the wrist was a band of gold. The objects were given to authorities the following day, and experts set about searching the location where the treasure had been discovered. There, they found one of the fingers that had become detached from the hand, other bronze artifacts, and the bones of a middle-aged male. At first, there were suspicions that this might have been a hoax. The hand was cast from a pound of bronze and was roughly the same size as a teenager's hand. Nothing like this had ever been found in Europe. The gold band around the wrist of the hand had been glued to the bronze using a vegetable-based glue. Scientists were able to carbon date the adhesive and found that it dated back to between 1400 and 1500 BC, and that places it in the Middle Bronze Age. Archaeologists discovered that the man had been buried on top of a stone structure, which is believed to date back even earlier. It was clear this was a very important person, but who he was remains a mystery. The purpose of the bronze hand is also a mystery. It's the oldest bronze piece representing a piece of the body that's ever been found, and the burial is very unique. It's not believed that the hand was worn by a person, but there is a cavity that would have allowed it to be placed onto something. It may have been part of a statue or a scepter. Neither of these objects have been discovered, though. Cracking the mystery of the man that the hand was buried with may solve this mystery of the purpose of this strange artifact. The medicine wheel in Bighorn National Forest, Wyoming, is one of the most impressive historical mysteries from North America. The main question surrounding the wheel is who created it. The medicine wheel is inaccessible for most of the year, with snow covering the structure, but in the summer months, the Wheel of Stones is visible on Medicine Mountain. The whole wheel has a diameter of roughly 80 feet. In the center is a cairn, a ring-shaped pile of rocks which is about 10 feet in diameter. 28 spokes connect the central cairn to the outer ring, and 6 more cairns lie along the outer edge of the ring. The rocks used in the structure are limestone and come from the surrounding areas. According to the Crow people, the tribe that lived on the land when Europeans arrived, the medicine wheel was already there when they arrived. They arrived at the site in roughly 1600, and the story goes that the leader of the tribe had a vision quest that made him realize that he had found their new home. One story told by a Crow elder named Tom Yellowtail is that of a man named Burnt Face, who was disfigured in an accident when he was young. Out of shame, he separated from the rest of the tribe and stayed in the area where the medicine wheel is today. He fasted, prayed, and built the medicine wheel. Eventually, he was approached by the little people who lived there, who healed his scars and sent him back to his tribe. In the story of Burnt Face, it specified that the door to the building he was creating looked towards the sun. The medicine wheel actually has many astronomical alignments. 2 of the outer cairns, when lined up with the central cairn, line up with the rising and setting of the sun at the summer solstice. Other alignments of various cairns line up with the dawn risings of 4 of the brightest stars in the sky. This can be used to tell the exact date. All 4 are connected to the summer solstice in some way. The dawn rising of Fomalhaut takes place 28 days before the summer solstice. Aldebaran has its dawn rising in 2 days before the solstice. Rigel has its 28 days after the solstice, and Sirius rises 28 days later. The exact date of the medicine wheel is hard to say. Estimates range from 300 to 800 years, while archaeologists have determined that the time period when the alignments were closest to being perfect was around 1200. The area of Medicine Mountain has also been an important place for Native Americans for thousands of years. Interestingly, it's also one of only 10 places on Earth called the nuclei of continents, a small patch of some of the oldest rocks on the planet. Who originally built the site may remain a mystery, but today it's an important site for many Native American groups who still practice various traditions and ceremonies in this important spiritual location. Some of the strangest historical mysteries are the locations of the final resting places of famous rulers that have been lost to history. While Egypt's Cleopatra and Macedonia's Alexander the Great are the most famous of these mysteries, Japan has its own mysterious figure with an unknown final resting place. Queen Himiko of Japan is a very mysterious figure. The oldest texts on Japanese history don't mention the ancient queen, but it's important to note that they were being written by people employed by the emperor, and Queen Himiko doesn't quite fit into the legendary story of the early days of the Yamato dynasty. The queen ruled between 180 and 248, a time period mostly covered by legendary stories in Japanese history. Everything we know about her comes from Chinese writing. According to Chinese records, Queen Himiko came to power after decades of war in the land of Wa, the name that they gave to Japan. Japan was split into many states at the time, but the one ruled by Himiko, Yamatai, became the most powerful under her rule. She sent envoys and tributes to the Chinese emperor and was given the title Ruler of Wa, Friend of Wei. In 247, she sent a request for support from the Wei, as there was a conflict with another state. The outcome of the conflict isn't known, but it's believed Queen Himiko passed away either that year or the year after. The queen was said to have mystical powers and was likely an important religious figure at the time. There is debate over how much of the ruling she actually did and how much fell to her brother, but the Chinese believed that she, rather than her brother, wielded great power. After the passing of Himiko, the land fell into another warring states period, and eventually the Yamato dynasty came to power. It's not known if the early Yamato emperors were related to Himiko. According to tradition, the Japanese emperors all descend from the sun goddess, and only one family has ruled since 660 BC. Of course, the first 100 years of that rule, including the time when Himiko would have been in power, are legendary, and it's likely that many states did exist across Japan at that time. It's possible that Himiko ruled in one area and Yamato emperors ruled in another. Interestingly, around the same time that Himiko was said to be in power, the legendary Yamato ruler is said to be Empress Jinju, the wife of the previous emperor who ruled as regent for her son until he was old enough to rule. It's possible Himiko and Jinju were the same person, but there are noticeable differences between the two women, and scholars believe that they were separate people. Where the land of Yamatai is remains a mystery, although there are a few possible areas suggested by archaeologists. Unsurprisingly, the tomb of Queen Himiko is also missing. In 2009, archaeologists believe they had located the tomb in the town of Sakurai. Carbon dating dates the tomb to around the time Himiko passed away. Unfortunately, further study is prohibited by the royal family of Japan, so whether this is Himiko's tomb remains a mystery. It's well known that Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, but if it weren't for the skills of one man, that accolade would have likely gone the way of Elisha Gray. Lewis Latimer was a patent draftsman and inventor in his own right, who played an important role in the electric industry, as our world started to be lit up by electricity. Lewis was born in 1848 in Massachusetts. His parents were runaway slaves who had escaped Virginia about 6 years earlier. His father, George Latimer, was later captured by the slave owner, but was bought by abolition supporters who set him free. Lewis fought in the American Civil War and was honorably discharged in 1865. After that, he began his civilian life as an office boy at a patent law firm. Lewis was incredibly talented and soon caught the attention of his superiors with his ability to both quickly and accurately sketch patent drawings. His talent was undeniable, so despite the prejudices against him, he was promoted to head draftsman. By 1876, he was being sought after by inventors to draft patents for their new devices. One such inventor was Bell. It was a rush to get the patent for the telephone to the office, as Elisha Gray had also finished work on a similar device. Due to Lewis's ability to work quickly and accurately, and his dedication to the job, Bell's patent was submitted hours before Gray's. Lewis had sat up much of the night working on the patent, which undoubtedly secured Bell's place in the history books. Meanwhile, Lewis was creating inventions of his own. He had no formal education, but that didn't stop his creativity or his logic. He worked with another inventor on creating improved bathroom compartments for railroad trains, and eventually began working for the chief rival of Thomas Edison. While working there, Lewis created his most famous invention. It was an improvement on the light bulb popularized by Edison. Edison's bulbs could only last days at a time before they burned out. By encasing the carbon filament inside the bulb with a cardboard envelope, Lewis was able to make the filaments last longer, increasing the life of the bulb. It was the final crucial step into making electric lighting widespread. He was charged with leading the planning team that would bring electric lighting to the streets of Philadelphia, New York, and Montreal, as well as government buildings in Canada and London. Lewis would later work with Thomas Edison, representing him in court, helping to draft patents and inspect plants in search of infringements on Edison's patents. He also literally wrote the book on incandescent lighting. Away from light bulbs, he continued to invent devices of his own, including improvements to elevators and a device that cooled and disinfected hospital rooms. He passed away in 1928 at the age of 80. Marozia of Tusculum was one of the most influential women in medieval Europe. But between rumors that muddied the waters even shortly after she passed away, and stories that have been told in the centuries since, she has become forgotten by history. Marozia was the daughter of the Count of Tusculum, who had control of the papacy and Rome at the time. The Pope at the time was Sergius III, one of the most corrupt in the country's history. He came to power through force, and had the two others vying for the throne thrown into prison, where they passed away due to less than natural causes. While she was still a young woman, Marozia was given by her parents to Sergius to become his mistress. She was eventually married to a noble named Alberic I of Spoleto. Marozia bore Alberic 4 sons, but strangely, his eldest son John went into the church. Usually, the eldest son would be one in line to inherit his father's titles, so wouldn't take a church position. However, it would be John's younger brother who would inherit his father's titles, which only added to speculation that John was actually the Pope's son. Marozia's family had been the power behind the throne of St. Peter for a while, and when her parents passed away, Marozia took over that role. Her first husband had already passed away from natural causes at the time, and she married the enemy of the new Pope and brother of the King of Italy, Guy of Tuscany. Marozia and Guy had the Pope, John X, thrown into prison where he was later smothered with a pillow. She then hand-selected the next 2 popes who would keep the seat warm until her eldest son was old enough to take the papacy himself. Marozia was effectively ruler of Rome at this time, so when her second husband passed away, the King of Italy decided he should marry her himself. This was when everything fell apart for Marozia. Her Pope's son approved the marriage and the two were wed, but their second son, Alberic II, was less happy with the arrangement. An argument broke out between Alberic and King Hugh of Italy after Alberic accidentally spilled water on the king. Hugh slapped him, and he went to the people of Rome to start a riot. He claimed the city would perish due to the impurity of one woman, and that if the king could slap his own stepson, what would he do to the people of Rome? The people stormed the palace. Hugh managed to escape, but Marozia was captured and thrown in prison, where she passed away a few years later. Alberic became the de facto ruler of Rome, so any possibility of an unbiased view of Marozia's life disappeared. Henrietta Lacks was an ordinary woman born in 1920 in Virginia. She would pass away 31 years later due to cancer, leaving behind 5 children and a husband. But unbeknownst to her and her family, she left behind a legacy that literally lives on today. Henrietta was an African-American woman whose mother passed away when she was 4 years old. As a result, Henrietta went to live with relatives and had to drop out of school when she was in the 6th grade to help tend to the family farm. She started a family of her own with her cousin, Day Lacks, and the two were married in 1941. Later that year, they moved to Baltimore so Day could work in a steel mill while Henrietta stayed home and raised the children. The couple had 5 children, the last of which was born at the Johns Hopkins Hospital just 4 months before Henrietta was diagnosed with cervical cancer. Johns Hopkins Hospital was one of few places Henrietta could get medical care due to her race. However, there was little they could do to stop the spread of her cancer. At one point, a specimen was taken, and without her knowledge or consent, it was sent to a lab. Researchers were trying to create a continuously reproducing cell line. At the time, medical consent laws meant samples could be used from patients without their knowledge, and researchers had tried to create this line with the cells of countless individuals and failed. They had no reason to believe Henrietta's cells would be any different, but they were. The cells survived and reproduced. While individual cells had a limited lifespan, the line itself was scientifically immortal. It was the first immortal human cell line to be discovered. The discovery was huge for medical science. While the Johns Hopkins Center made no profit from the cells, they were given away to other medical researchers. New medicines and treatments for various diseases were discovered using the cells. The HeLa cells, as they became known, were important to the development of the polio vaccine, saving countless lives and for our understanding of how cancer develops. These discoveries meant big profit for medical companies, but the Lacks family saw none of it. Henrietta passed away in 1951. She was in great pain at the end of her life. Her children were not allowed to visit, so Day would take them to the park across from the medical center, and Henrietta would watch them through the window. Medical and money problems continued to plague the family, who had struggled enough when Henrietta was alive. By 2000, all Henrietta's surviving children had medical problems, and her husband had asbestos-filled lungs. They weren't able to get medical insurance either. With the help of Rebecca Skloot, a biological scientist who wrote a book on Henrietta, things have begun to change, and there is more recognition for Henrietta and others like her who made huge changes to medicine without their knowledge. A foundation has been set up to help their descendants. It was a real-life house of horrors. Special containers for preserving human meat, shoelaces, and leather items made from human skin, and barrels of salt mixtures designed for decomposing corpses. For most true crime fans, the setup is eerily similar to that of the infamous Ed Gein, or perhaps the likes of Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy. But long before these real-life horror staples, there was Karl Denk, known as the Forgotten Cannibal. Denk's crimes had been largely forgotten to history. Having taken place during interwar Germany, there was much more going on at the time that quickly overtook headlines about this malicious criminal. But it's easy to see reflections of his crimes in modern-day horror. Denk was born in Prussia in 1870. He was from a relatively well-off family, his father owning a farm. Not much is known about his early years besides the fact that he was a terrible student, and he ran away from home at the age of 12. But there didn't seem to be any signs of the real-life horrors that would come. When his father passed away, Denk inherited a large chunk of money, which he used to buy a house. He would rent out rooms in the house, but was also known as a kind and generous man who would let vagrants stay for free. In the small town where he lived, he was known as Father Denk and was a well-respected member of the community. He played the organ at church and would carry the cross during services. But with the post-war inflation destroying Germany's economy, he lost much of his wealth. He was forced to sell the house, but continued to rent out a room on the ground floor. To make ends meet, he owned a meat shop in town and was licensed to sell pork goods in a neighboring city. He was known for his boneless, pickled pork. While that doesn't sound particularly appetizing today, his goods were popular given the economic crisis at the time. He also sold leather goods like shoelaces and belts, sometimes door to door. Knowing what we know of Dank today, it's unsurprising that there was an outbreak of stomach disorders in the local area in 1925. It was December of 1924 when Dank was finally caught. At this point, it's possible he had been operating for 15 years. He'd recently taken in a homeless man named Vincent Olivier. On December 21st, 1924, he went to the police station with evidence that he had been attacked by an axe. He claimed Dank was responsible. This was unbelievable to police, seeing as Dank was such an upstanding member of the community, and Vincent himself was thrown in jail for vagrancy. However, police did investigate the accusation. Dank claimed he had attacked Vincent in self-defense, which was believable enough, but he was still put into a cell while police investigated. He would pass away in his cell that night, and police would discover the large amount of human remains in his apartment, complete with logs of who exactly had been the victims of his crimes. Despite the scandal leading to pork sales plummeting that winter, it was largely forgotten. Without documentation, it's hard to say why, but it's possible economic conditions at the time, combined with Dank's reputation, allowed people to convince themselves he had been trying to help the community. Or perhaps it was a case of not wanting to talk about something so dark. The fact that this story was so easily forgotten makes it one of the creepiest moments in history. There are likely thousands of unsung heroes from World War II who saved the lives of countless people, yet their stories are widely forgotten. Whether it's government officials who helped smuggle out innocent people from access-controlled locations, or individual soldiers who went above and beyond the call of duty, it's easy to forget an individual's actions when looking at the war as a whole. One of the unsung heroes of the war was a man named Witold Pilecki. Witold is largely unheard of outside of Poland, and even there, his achievements were censored up until the fall of the Soviet Union in Poland in late 1989. Witold was a veteran of the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921, and when Poland was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union at the start of World War II, he joined the resistance. When the Germans set up Auschwitz camp, very little was known about it by outsiders. The resistance thought it was a normal prisoner of war camp, not a nice place to be, but nothing like the horrors that would soon be revealed. Witold believed that there was more to the camp though, and pressured his superiors to clear him for a mission inside. Eventually they agreed with the fake identity, and he positioned himself inside a protest march in September of 1940. He and the other civilians were rounded up and taken to Auschwitz. Witold Pilecki was able to smuggle out information about the horrendous conditions and punishments inflicted on prisoners at the camp. He described physical and mental torture and the continuous worsening of conditions. Meanwhile, he managed to set up a resistance movement inside the camp, in the hopes that they would get word from outside to launch an attack and take over. But the word never came. His reports found their way to the desks of the British and American governments, as the Polish government in exile tried to convince them to take action, either by letting Polish paratroopers launch an attack, or destroying the railway lines into the camp. But the Allies were silent. Eventually, the water became too hot for Witold. He believed the information he had on the camp was too valuable to let himself be taken out by the officers that were closing in on the resistance, and managed to escape from the camp after 2.5 years. It wouldn't be long before he was captured by Soviets, and spent the remainder of the war in a Red Army prisoner of war camp. After the war, the camp was liberated by American troops, and Witold went to Italy, but his sense of duty to Poland meant that he wouldn't stay there for long. He returned to Poland to gather intelligence on the Soviet regime there, but his cover was blown, and he was captured again in 1947. After so many heroic acts during World War II, he received capital punishment at the hands of the Soviets in 1948, and his name was censored for decades after. Today, Witold Pilecki is a venerated figure in Polish history, and he was given Poland's highest military honor in 2006. There's no doubt that there are some very smart animals in the world, a good example of this being ravens, which have proven to possess a higher level of planning skills than human toddlers. Dolphins are able to change their hunting grounds to avoid humans in their usual areas, and octopuses have learned to use weapons as they've been seen using the tentacles from the Portuguese man-o'-war against predators. These are truly remarkable animals, but not everything is always as it seems, as is evidenced by a case from 1900 involving a horse named Clever Hans, which seemed to possess abnormal intelligence for an animal, much to the surprise of scientists who decided to study it. Clever Hans hailed from Russia, and he belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Wilhelm van Osten. Before Hans came along, however, Van Osten had been trying to prove that some animals are just as smart as humans, and to do this, he tried to teach a cat, a bear, and Hans how to do arithmetic. He had no luck with the cat and the bear, both of which had no interest in learning any math. But it seemed that Hans had a talent for it, and Van Osten decided to make the most of his discovery. First, he claimed that Hans could count from 1 to 9, and he taught him this skill using skittles. When Van Osten asked Hans how many skittles there were, the horse would stomp its hoof on the ground, counting out the correct number every time. The skittles were eventually replaced with numbers, and before long, Hans could do simple sums such as adding and subtracting. And again, he never failed to give the correct answer to the delight of large crowds of people who had heard of this remarkable animal. News of Hans's abilities quickly spread, and before long, the scientific community took an interest, and a few scientists decided to test Van Osten and his horse in case there was something untoward going on. But they were soon also convinced about the horse's intelligence, concluding that it had the mathematical ability of a 14-year-old human child. Hans's talents became a worldwide sensation, but not everyone was convinced. A second group of scientists decided to conduct a series of tests over a 5-week period, but even then, Hans was infallible in his answers. But still, they were concerned that they were being fooled, and it was all just a clever trick, and so a psychologist named Oscar Funkst suggested that they repeat some of the tests without Van Osten present. This time, the numbers were written down on a blackboard, and the examiner would then leave the room while everyone else present was shielded by the board so that the horse couldn't see them. The same tests were repeated a second time, with no one in the room knowing the answer to the sum, and it soon became obvious that there was some trickery involved, as Hans got every single answer wrong. It was then discovered that Hans, while not a very talented mathematician, had a different talent, that of reading body language. The horse was able to read the smallest movements made by Van Osten, such as subtly nodding his head or tapping his hand against his leg. It was also suggested that Hans could read facial expressions and feel the anticipation of his observers via their heartbeats as he neared the correct answer, and so he was able to land on the correct number every time. While it was proven that Hans wasn't the genius that his owner claimed he was, his talent of reading human gestures is still quite impressive. But as soon as his admirers found out that it was all a hoax, his popularity dwindled. But he is remembered today as a precautionary tale that one should always look closer if something seems too good to be true. In May of 1957, a U.S. Air Force pilot named Milton Torres was stationed at the Royal Air Force Base at Manston in Kent, England amidst the Cold War. And during this time, he would experience an event that he's still struggling to explain. On the 20th of May, he was told to scramble his F-86D Sabre fighter jet as an unidentified flying object had been spotted in the skies over East Anglia. As soon as Torres reached altitude, he asked whether he should throttle down, but to his surprise, he was told to go full throttle, which means that he would have been flying at around 700 miles per hour. Furthermore, he was instructed to fire a full volley of rockets as soon as he got close enough to the object, an order that he found unusual, but he was ready to comply as he sped towards the strange craft, with his radar showing that it was as big as an aircraft carrier. He was still about 15 miles away from the object when he was able to lock onto it, but hadn't actually seen it with his own eyes. Still, he was ready to let loose as soon as he could, since he calculated that he could intercept it in about 10 seconds. But before he could do so, the object suddenly sped off at unimaginable speed, leaving Torres behind and wondering exactly what he'd been chasing through the night sky. The chase ended there, and Torres was ordered to return to base. Once he landed, he was taken to a man who was dressed in civilian clothes, who then told him that the incident would be considered classified from here on out, and that he wasn't to discuss anything that happened with anyone. But the strangeness didn't end there. The next day, he was confronted by a man who he described as dressed like an IBM salesman, who reminded him of the consequences if he were to breach national security by discussing the incident with anyone. In retrospect, Torres felt glad that he never managed to fire any rockets at the object, since he was sure that a craft with such superior maneuvering capabilities would have had superior weaponry, and if his pursuit was successful, the consequences could have been dire. He's since stated that he's unimpressed with the lack of information about the incident that's been made available to the public, and he added that he's certain there's a lot more information that the British and US governments are keeping from the general population. Since he's never been given any explanation by his superior officers, Torres is still uncertain what it was that he was chasing that night. But he has stated that he's sure it wasn't from our planet, as according to his plane's radar, it was traveling at speeds as high as Mach 10, a feat that has never been achieved by any of our aircraft. It's a mystery that may never be solved, since much of the information on the event is still classified, and for now we can only speculate what the object was and where it came from. Most of us are familiar with the trope of a message in a bottle, where someone places a message that's been scrawled on a piece of paper in a glass bottle and throws it into the ocean, after which it's found by someone hundreds or even thousands of miles away. In some stories, the message is a cry for help from someone who's stuck on an island in the middle of the ocean, while in others, it's a long-lost message to a loved one or a few words of wisdom to whoever finds the bottle. The chances of finding one of these messages are very slim indeed, which is why a couple from Perth, Australia was very surprised when they stumbled across a glass bottle containing a piece of paper while walking on a beach one day. On the 21st of January, 2018, husband and wife Tanya and Kim Illman were strolling along a beach in Western Australia when they spotted the weird object amongst several other pieces of trash that had been washed up on the shore. Tanya was the first to spot the pile of trash and, being a good citizen, decided to clean it up. And while doing so, she found the bottle and realized that it had what looked like a message inside. She showed it to Kim and asked what he thought it might be, but he had no idea. So they decided to open it after taking it back to their home. Once there, they removed the piece of paper, but found it was too fragile to open in its damp state, and so they placed it in their oven to dry out. Once this was done, they were finally able to open it, and they discovered that it dated back to the 12th of June, 1886, and it was thrown from a German ship named Paula, on orders from the German Naval Observatory. The printed message asked whoever found it to contact the German consulate, since the message was part of an experiment involving shipping routes, but they were unsure whether it was authentic. To get some answers, the couple took the note to the Western Australia Museum, where it was studied by experts and declared to be completely genuine. They also checked the ship's meteorological journal and found an entry from the day that the bottle was thrown into the ocean. The date and coordinates where it was released from the ship, as well as the handwriting, matched on both the journal and the message, confirming it was definitely authentic. Records show that the Paula was on its way to Indonesia after setting out from Wales, and the message was thrown into the Indian Ocean. As for how the piece of paper inside the bottle remained intact for as long as it did, it was likely due to the bottle's narrow opening and thick glass that kept it protected from the elements. The message has now found a place in the Guinness World Records as the longest surviving message in a bottle ever, found at 132 years, the previous being 108 years. Conquerors in all of history, as he seemed to let nothing get in his way during his reign, eventually establishing the largest land colony in all of history, while his forces invaded and conquered large parts of Asia and China. But not many people know that his great-great-granddaughter, named Kulon, who was born in 1260, was also a force to be reckoned with, as she refused to marry any man who couldn't beat her in a wrestling contest. But she wasn't just a prolific fighter at home. She was equally as comfortable on the battlefield, since she's known to have fought alongside her father, Kaidu Khan, while he was battling Kublai Khan, who endeavored to transform Mongolian traditions towards a more Chinese lifestyle. What stood in her good stead was the fact that she was an excellent archer, wrestler, and equestrian, 3 disciplines that are still considered to be Mongolia's national sports in the modern era. Marco Polo wrote that Kulon was, quote, so well made in all of her limbs and so tall and strongly built that she might almost be taken for a giantess. And he added that she was challenged by many men in her kingdom, all of whom were defeated by her. Thanks to her talents and unwillingness to give up, there were many men in the kingdom who wanted to marry her, but understandably, not just anyone would be allowed to wed the daughter of 2 prolific conquerors. And so she devised a challenge in which any man who could defeat her in a wrestling match would win her hand in marriage, and before long, hundreds of would-be suitors announced that they would try to best her. But to add to the stakes of the challenge, every man who tried his hand at defeating her would have to gift her several horses if he lost. And after being challenged by 1,000 men, she amassed a total of 10,000 horses, since she didn't lose a single contest. Kulon did eventually decide to get married, but history books are varied on who her husband was. Some sources state that she wed another Mongol ruler named Ghazan, whom she fell in love with, while others claim that she married one of her father's advisors, or a man who'd been taken prisoner by Kaidu Khan, who passed away in 1301. Before he passed away, he stated that he wanted his daughter to take his place, but her brothers wouldn't allow this, and she also passed away just a few years later in 1306, though she is remembered today for her exceptional wrestling skills and her bravery on the battlefield. Kulon was the last woman in Mongolia who was allowed to wrestle men, as they're now only permitted to wrestle against other men, and women are only allowed to wrestle against other women. Kulon truly breaks the mold when it comes to our idea of a princess in the modern era, as we're used to those depicted by Disney films. While those princesses are shown living lavish and pampered lifestyles in their castles, Kulon is seemingly the exact opposite, as she relished in a good battle or a contest of strength against men who were thought to be much stronger than her, but who came up short every single time. It's not often that a fictional piece of writing fools its readers into thinking that it's completely real, especially when claims made in the piece are extremely outlandish. But it's been known to happen. A good example of this is Orson Welles' famous 1938 radio broadcast of The War of the Worlds, which was adapted from a tale written by H.G. Wells. The story details an invasion by extraterrestrials from Mars who invade New Jersey with massive ships and destructive weapons that lay waste to everything in their path. Unbeknownst to Wells, many people who heard the broadcast believed it was real, and they contacted police stations, newspaper outlets, and radio stations to find out what was going on, only to be told that it was not meant to be taken seriously. Many people thought that it was an elaborately devised hoax, but Wells repeatedly stated that he and his team never imagined it would cause panic among the station's listeners. There are, however, many similar tales in which members of the public were fooled into believing outlandish claims by a hoax, one of which is still spoken about today, the Great Moon Hoax. It all started on the 25th of August, 1835, when the New York Sun newspaper ran a series of 6 articles that claimed that scientists had found proof that there was life on the moon. The 6 articles were originally printed in the Edinburgh Journal of Science and stated that Sir John Herschel, a well-known astronomer, had been visiting Cape Town, South Africa the previous year to aid in establishing a new observatory, from where he planned to catalog stars and other heavenly bodies that could be observed from the southern hemisphere's skies. The article went on to claim that Herschel was a colleague of Dr. Andrew Grant's, and that he shared what he saw with the doctor. This included fantastical sights such as unicorns walking around on the moon, alongside 2-legged beavers and figures that resembled humans, but that had large wings similar to those that bats have. They also claimed that the moon contained massive amethyst crystals, huge craters, beautiful rivers, and thriving plant life. Since the New York Sun was one of the cheaper newspapers at the time, it was read by a lot of people, many of whom didn't realize that the articles were meant to be satire. But it wasn't just the general public that was fooled. A group of scientists from Yale University caught wind of the news and traveled to New York to investigate further by locating the original articles. Despite finding no proof that the claims were genuine, they eventually traveled back to Connecticut, still firmly believing that one of the greatest scientific discoveries in all of history had been made. It wasn't until almost a month later, on the 16th of September, that the Sun admitted that the entire thing had been a hoax and that there was still no evidence that there was life on the moon, much to the disappointment and embarrassment of many of their readers. It's been suggested that the hoax was effective for this length of time, since Herschel was still in South Africa, and even if he'd heard about the claims, there was no way for him to refute them in time. The case is often cited as a good example of the gullibility of humans and our inclination to believe most things that were told by the media, though a claim such as this would definitely be met with far more skepticism today. Imagine if you were told that you had the opportunity to relocate to a country where you would never want for anything, where all your needs would be met thanks to the abundance of natural resources, and that you were one of just a select few who could make the journey. There are many among us who would jump at this chance, as did many people when they were told a similar tale in the mid-1800s. But their excitement was short-lived when they found out that it was all just a clever scheme to steal their money. The con artist in question was a Scottish man named Gregor MacGregor, who served in the Venezuelan War against Spain. Although he was an average soldier who didn't stand out in any real way, he soon convinced many well-to-do people in Britain in 1820 that he had committed many heroic acts during the war, and that he'd been gifted an 8 million-acre piece of land in Nicaragua by one of its indigenous leaders. He added that he'd been given the title of prince and that he was in the process of developing this land into a country called Poyais, proving his claims by producing maps, flags, and documents that, to the untrained eye, all seemed completely genuine. The next step in his plan was to rope in as many investors as he could, each of whom could secure a piece of land as large as 540 acres. These plots would then be divided into smaller sections for a lower price, and before long, he'd made a fortune. Since they were under the impression that he was a war hero, his investors felt that MacGregor could be trusted, and while in England, he was granted use of a large estate, while plans were being made for his shareholders to relocate to Poyais, where they would start completely new lives. But upon their arrival there, they quickly realized they'd been conned, since they were greeted by a barren landscape that held almost no natural resources. They had no choice but to try and survive, and so they started building shelters to keep themselves safe from the elements while a ship was sent to Brazil to rescue them, though some sources state that it was sent from Honduras. Strangely, many of those who were eventually saved didn't blame MacGregor for the scam, but stated that the leaders of the voyage should have ensured that they were better prepared for the harsh conditions that they faced. Realizing that it would only be a matter of time before he was confronted about the con, MacGregor fled from England in 1823 and settled in France with his ill-gotten gains firmly intact. Here, he once again tried to convince wealthy investors that Poyais was real, but he wasn't as successful as he was in Britain, as many people thought him to be suspicious. At one point, he was arrested for his exploits and he served a stint in prison, but he was eventually freed, after which he traveled back to Venezuela. Here, he was still thought of as a war hero, and he received a pension as thanks for his military service, and he would remain here for the rest of his life, never having faced the full consequences of his reckless scheme. Some people believe that MacGregor only got away with his scam because other, more influential figures were in it, but there's no way of proving it, and the theory remains mere speculation. Most of us will never understand the hardships faced by those who live in oppressive countries, but we do know that those who are subjected to these conditions would likely do anything for a better life elsewhere, as is evidenced by a case from 1979. During this time, two men named Gunter Wetzel and Peter Strelzek were living in East Germany with their families, but they'd been thinking of a plan to escape the region for a number of years, since West Germany was flourishing in direct contrast to the East, whose citizens were struggling to survive. But to do this, they would have to find a way to cross over the Berlin Wall, something that would not be easy to accomplish, and if they were caught, the resulting punishment would likely be very harsh. In March of 1978, Wetzel saw photos of hot air balloons in a magazine, and he immediately thought that this would be the perfect way to escape. He told Strelzyk about his idea, and the two men decided that they would construct their own balloon, but it had to be big enough to carry both families. Though the two men had no accurate measurements of the balloons and the photos, they worked out the scale as best they could by comparing people in the pictures to the size of the balloons. They estimated that their balloon would have to be about 63,500 cubic feet in size, and they started procuring pieces of fabric and other materials, which they secretly kept hidden in Wetzel's home, out of sight of the authorities. Next, they had to make sure they had enough gas to make the journey, and they constructed their own tank out of a stovepipe, a gas cylinder, a valve, and several nozzles. The basket wasn't made from the traditional fibers that we know, but was instead constructed out of solid steel that would put further strain on the balloon, but the two men were certain that it would work. They then conducted a test flight, but discovered that they'd used the wrong material, since heat from the gas cylinder was passing right through the balloon rather than inflating it. Realizing that they had failed, they burned the material to get rid of any proof of their endeavor. But now they knew that they could construct a balloon without being caught, and so they started all over again. They decided that taffeta would be the perfect material, and they managed to buy enough to construct their even larger balloon. But during the construction process, the two men had an argument, and Wetzel decided that he would start construction on an airplane to get his family across the wall, while Strelzyk continued work on the balloon. Strelzyk finished his project first, and the following year, he and his family took off in the newly constructed balloon in the early hours of the morning. But it didn't quite go to plan, as they passed through a cloud that weighed the fabric down and crashed short of their mark by about 600 feet. Wetzel got word of the failed flight, but he was certain that he could get it to work. So he and Strelzyk put their differences aside and tried again. They set about building an even larger balloon out of all sorts of fabric, and after 5 weeks of work, it was completed. While keeping an eye out for the authorities, they inflated the balloon in about 5 minutes and climbed into the basket, still fearing for their lives if they were discovered. But their takeoff was successful, and before long they reached an altitude of 6,500 feet. They relied on the wind to carry them to safety, but before long they noticed lights burning at a border crossing, and they knew they were close to their goal. But then disaster struck. They were rapidly running out of gas, and the balloon started to descend, eventually crashing in a wooded area. But as soon as they started exploring the area, they knew they'd made it across the wall, as they started seeing landmarks that they were unfamiliar with, and West German police officers confirmed they'd landed in the town of Nela, and they were now free. In 1973, Mario Fabrini had immigrated to America from Italy, and he was running a frozen pizza company called Papa Fabrini Pizzas in his new hometown in Michigan. His business had been flourishing until February of that year, when he received some unfortunate news. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration had informed him that they were recalling cans of mushrooms that were suspected to be responsible for an outbreak of botulism at a canning factory in Ohio. This was dire news, since it meant that he would need to get rid of thousands of his mushroom and cheese pizzas, since tests done on his product were found to be too dangerous to consume. But he devised a plan to turn this unfortunate event into something positive, publicity for his business. He decided to hold a mass funeral for the pizzas, and made sure that as many people as possible heard about the event. In the end, he collected more than 30,000 pizzas from his customers, and calculated that he stood to lose around $30,000 from the incident, and he knew that the funeral had to be a success, or he would stand to lose everything he'd worked so hard to achieve. Luckily, word of the strange event spread quickly, and several hundred people showed up to witness the pizza funeral. They watched as trucks pulled up to a massive 18-foot deep grave into which the pizzas were dumped. Even Governor William Milliken attended the event and joined other revelers as they tucked into a fresh batch of pizzas that Fabrini was serving on site. When all the pizzas had been disposed of, the whole was covered up, and Fabrini placed a red gladioli garland representing sauce and a white one made from carnations representing cheese on the covered grave. In the end, it would turn out none of this was necessary after all, as the FDA announced that they'd made a mistake and that the mushrooms were not responsible for any illnesses, and that the recall was done in error. Since he'd lost a lot of money, Fabrini sued the suppliers of the mushrooms, a company called United Canning. They claimed that Fabrini had voluntarily recalled the 30,000 pizzas, but they were told that the FDA was on the brink of informing Fabrini's customers that his pizzas could result in botulism. And so he won the case since the court found that he had no choice but to recall his products. He was awarded $211,000 in compensation, but he would eventually sell his company in the 1980s after business took a downturn. Strangely, the FDA never faced any consequences for announcing the recall, and it isn't known where Fabrini went after Papa Fabrini Pizzas closed down. The Great Pizza Funeral was a very strange event that's still spoken about in the area today, and it's likely to be remembered for a very long time to come. Growing up in Hamburg, West Germany, 19-year-old Mathias Rust had developed an interest in flying. He also spent a lot of time worrying that conflicts would break out in the area, since relations between the East and West were tentative in 1987, to say the least. He also learned that the US-Soviet summit had been held in Iceland the previous year and had ended without an arms reduction agreement, so he felt more certain than ever that there would be conflict at some point. He felt that he needed to make a statement that would bring attention to the dire situation, and so he decided to cross the Berlin Wall, an act that would see him being sent to prison for a long time, if not worse. It would be a seriously daunting task, since he would have to complete his journey without being detected, but he felt that if he was successful, it would send a message to the US that Mikhail Gorbachev was sincere in his statements that he wanted to renew relations with the West, since no evil empire would allow a teenager in a small plane to cross the Iron Curtain. Rust only had about 50 hours of flying under his belt before he decided to make his historic flight, and he felt that he had about a 50% chance of completing his mission, but he also felt that it was something that he needed to do since no one else would dare. As part of a flying club, he booked a 1980 Cessna Skyhawk 172, since he felt that it would carry enough fuel for him to complete his mission. He packed some provisions that included a sleeping bag, some engine oil, maps, and flight planning equipment. On the 13th of May, 1987, he took off from Uterson Airfield and proceeded to fly to the Shetland Islands. From there, he continued on to the Faroe Islands and eventually made it to Reykjavik. On the 25th of May, he flew to Finland and his test flight was complete. But his biggest test was yet to come, as he had to make it into Moscow undetected. 3 days later, he set out on his final leg and was told by air traffic controllers to fly towards Stockholm. About 20 minutes later, he left the controller's area, and a few minutes later, he pointed his plane toward Moscow. Air traffic controllers in Tampere noticed his sudden change of direction and they tried to contact him, but to no avail. He was also being tracked by Soviet military personnel in Latvia, and missile units were ordered to ready themselves in case they needed to bring the plane down. Several jets were scrambled to his location, but quite unbelievably, he was allowed to continue on his course. By the time that Rust reached Moscow, it was too late for anything to be done about his flight, and he landed his plane in the Red Square, since he knew there would be plenty of witnesses and that he couldn't just be arrested. He got out, and soon a large crowd had gathered around his plane, after which he stated that he wanted to talk to Gorbachev. When the authorities eventually arrived, Rust's plane was towed away, and he was taken to Lefortovo prison. He was charged with illegal entry, violation of flight laws, and malicious hooliganism. He pleaded guilty to the first two charges and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but he was released in August of 1988. This was the last flight that Rust ever made. We all enjoy a good laugh, but imagine what it would be like if you started laughing one day and found that no matter what you did, you couldn't stop. It was a terrifying prospect, but one that's very real, as is evidenced by an incident that took place in Tanzania in 1962. At the time, the country was still called Tanganyika, and it contained a small boarding school for girls on the coast of Lake Victoria. At some point on this particular day, 3 of the girls attending the school started to giggle. Some sources state that it was after a joke was told, but this hasn't been confirmed. Before long, their giggles turned into all-out laughter that started to spread to their classmates. Teachers would later report that the students were laughing uncontrollably at one point, but then started crying as if they were inconsolable. These bouts would last a few minutes in some cases, while others went on for hours on end, and they were at a loss as to what caused it or how to get the students to calm down, as all their efforts to do so had failed. Some of the students started experiencing breathing problems, with some fainting as a result. Others stated that they were feeling dizzy or that they'd suddenly broken out in an inexplicable rash that caused them a lot of discomfort. Out of desperation, teachers called for doctors and then psychologists who were unable to find a reason for their strange behavior. And soon it was speculated that the students were being affected by some sort of toxin, but tests were carried out and proved that this wasn't the cause. This behavior continued into the month of March, and school officials decided that the students needed to go home. This proved to be a mistake, as the laughter then started infecting people in several other areas where the girls lived. This would continue for a further 18 months, as ever more young people suddenly burst out with laughter and found that they couldn't contain themselves no matter how hard they tried. Though most of the people involved in this laughing hysteria were women, some men were also affected, but luckily everyone survived and suffered no further ill effects. It's now been speculated that these prolonged fits of laughter were caused by mass psychogenic illness, which is akin to mass hysteria. Experts state that this is often caused by stressful situations that affect a large group of people. It's also been suggested that the epidemic wasn't brought on by a joke being told, but rather due to the stress experienced by the girls, since the boarding school had very strict rules and was being run by foreign teachers. They'd also been away from their families for quite some time and likely felt trapped, but this theory has been challenged since it doesn't account for the hundreds of people who were affected after the students were sent home. Some researchers suggest that the country's citizens were indeed feeling stressed, since they had just gained independence from Britain and were unsure whether the new socialist state would have their best interests at heart. It was a massive change that resulted in a lot of uncertainty, and maybe a fit of uncontrollable laughter was the only way the stress could be released, albeit in a very unusual manner. It remains a very strange mystery that's never been fully solved, and until further research finds some answers, it may never be. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.